Hey, it's July 14th, and we find ourselves in the book of Micah. For over the past decade, superheroes have been really popular around the world. In our society, we love the idea of justice. We don't like it when people are treated unfairly, especially if it's us. When injustice happens, we get upset. Sometimes people even blame God. God is not blind to injustice, and he does deal with it properly. Injustice happens not because God does it, but because we do. Injustice is also a spiritual issue we'll see for God's people. It is our problem to prevent and correct. The book of Micah is all about the need for God's people to live justly. In chapter 1, verse 1, we see that Micah wrote this during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah, to God's people both in Judah and Samaria, to correct their injustice and idolatry. In chapter 2, God points out their injustice. Now, biblical injustice is when those with power use it to abuse those without it. Verse 1 says, "Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is in the power of their hand." God's people weren't only guilty of turning a blind eye to injustice, claiming it wasn't their problem. They actually took part in it themselves. Verses 8 and 9 go on to say, "But lately, my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich robe from those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. The women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From their young children you take away my splendor forever." You see, God cares about justice. It's part of who he is. Deuteronomy 32:4 says he is the rock. His works are perfect and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. Because God is concerned about justice, God's people should be too. In chapter 3, we see that biblical injustice is also when those who can do good don't. Verses 9 through 11 say, "Hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, who detest justice and make crooked all that is straight, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. Its heads give judgment for a bribe, its priests teach for a price, its prophets practice divination for money. Israel's own government and religious leaders despised justice. They should know and do what is right instead of ignoring it." God expects his people to do something about injustice. Chapter 4 fast forwards to the end times, showing us that in the last days, the temple will be rebuilt and there will be world peace, referring to the millennium in Revelation 20. But before that, Babylon will take Judah captive, but God will rescue them after a time. In chapter 5, we again get more details on Jesus' birth, specifically where he would be born. In verse 2 it says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah," that's the town of Bethlehem just outside of Jerusalem, "who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days." And God also promises Judah that Assyria would not conquer them, only Israel. Chapter 6, verse 8, is what we can take away from today's passage. So what should we do? Micah 6:8 says, "He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness or mercy and to walk humbly with your God." First, we are to act justly. Religious activity does not excuse us from acting justly. God has shown us what it looks like to act justly. In Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, he says, "Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. Defend the cause of the fatherless and plead the case of the widow." And in Zechariah chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, it says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. In your hearts do not think evil of each other." Second, we are to love kindness or mercy. Mercy is not getting something bad that we absolutely deserve. Do not take pleasure in the punishment of the evil. We are to pursue forgiveness. And third, we are to walk or live humbly with God. We are to live in the constant worship of God. Now, worship is making everything that we say, think, and do something that praises him. And we are to do this humbly. We don't become prideful about our worship because we realize we are not perfect yet. My prayer for us today is that we understand that injustice happens not because God causes it, but because we do. That we know God is not blind to the problem, and He does deal properly with it in His perfect time. Remember, He is patient with us, giving sinners the opportunity to be saved. And injustice is a spiritual issue for us as God's people to prevent or correct. It is our problem. If you haven't done so already, please download our Through the Bible reading plan at asperrycommunitychurch.org/throughthebible. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.